morning.
Good morning.
So I got all kinds of stuff to share with you this morning. The first is I was at the doctor's yesterday and he really bummed me out. I don't know where to begin, where to end, but I will say this. Have you felt like as you get older your body betrays you? And do you ever get angry at it? I mean, do you get angry at the fact that your body is betraying you as you get older?
It's good to get angry.
So does anybody know what to do to fight back?
Live well. Keep living as well as you can.
I would like to implore all of you to figure out a way to get some kind of exercise on a regular basis. Okay? Part of my report yesterday wasn't so great, but part of it was great because as some of you know, over a year ago, I had detached retina surgery. Prior to that, I was exercising like a fiend. I was working out. I was feeling really good. I felt like this exercise stuff is not so bad. But when I had the eye surgery, I couldn't do anything anymore. I had to stop for well over a year. And then I also found out the joy of having detached retina surgery is you get the extra bonus of having to have a cataract. It's wonderful. So my eye has not been the same since. But I'm not looking for any sympathy from you because I know I won't get it. But anyway, I couldn't work out. I couldn't exercise for a long time because I had to give the eye plenty of time to heal. So at Christmas time, I finally get back to exercising. Now, let me tell you what exercising is for me. Have you heard of the term elliptical trainer?
Yes.
I love the elliptical trainer because it does not hurt my knees. My knees are in pain 24/7 because I played a lot of sports when I was much younger. So I get on the elliptical trainer, and I remember the first time I said, I'm going to see if I can at least get 20 minutes in. After 10 minutes, I was dying. But I stuck it out to 20 minutes, and now I'm up to a half hour, and I do it 6 days a week. I didn't say I like to, but I just do it because I know that it's important for my body. So I had a physical right before Christmas, and the doctor said, I see some things that I don't like, so I want you to come back in 3 months. That was yesterday. And he said, well, I see some things have improved. Can you tell me why? And I said, yeah, I finally got back to exercising. And he says, well, it makes sense because I can see it in your chart. And then I'm fighting some other issues which really upset me. And he says, you know, Mark, sometimes it's just genetics. It's just what was in your family. And I'm racking my brains thinking, well, who in my family had this issue or that issue? The bottom line is this. I'm begging all of you, find a way to exercise, and exercise can be walking. If you just get your heartbeat up over get your heartbeat up. You can do that if you're walking for at least 20 minutes. You know, I just went out to get a bottle of water. Here's another thing that I hate about myself. I made sure before I left the house, I made a nice bottle of water. You know, one of those plastic bottles, sport bottles. I left it in the car. I don't want to go all the way back out to the car to get it. So I just went to get a bottle of water in the cafeteria. And it smells so good in the cafeteria. I didn't want to come back. I just want, whatever it is, give it to me. You know? So, where was I going?
Exercise.
Something to do with the water, right? Oh, so as I'm coming back, there's people out there line dancing. You know, that's a great form of exercise. Just please find a way to exercise. I know that the senior center has great exercise equipment. I don't think you have to join a gym, but I'm just begging all of you to find a way to exercise. And if you are thinking to yourself, Mark, the last thing I ever want to do is exercise, I get it. I know exactly how you feel. I'm just begging you to try to figure out a way to exercise, okay? They say if you can do at least 3 days a week, get your heartbeat up, go for a nice walk, something like that. That's a big, big help, but every little bit helps. Now the good news is there's some tremendous science breakthrough that's coming your way. I'm not going to tell you what it is yet, but it's on your way. It sounds kind of exciting, and I can't wait to hear more about it. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, as many of you know by now, I think you should know by now, that Bob Boucher wanted to step down from his role of making sure we had guest speakers, making sure everything is in order, because Bob wants to kind of reduce some stress in his life, because this can be stressful at times, believe it or not. But one of the things Bob was great at is he would contact our guest speaker before, maybe a few days before the guest speaker was supposed to come. It doesn't look like our guest speaker is showing up this morning. I did include our guest speaker in an email a couple of weeks ago. I just assumed he was going to be here. I did not have a phone number to contact that person. So one of the things I learned when we first started this is that I would always try to be prepared with something in case a guest speaker couldn't make it. So I will do my best to get in touch with that person, find out what happened to that person, and find a time where we can get that person back. In the meantime, I just feel it's a natural segue into our guest speaker for next month is something I'm really excited about. He came to our Cheshire group. I met him just by pure luck. He was a state senator for a while. He worked for Governor O'Neill. Do any of you remember that name, Governor O'Neill? Yeah, he had a bar in Connecticut. But he was kind of an old tough butt. You know, he wouldn't take crap from anybody that worked for the state of Connecticut. The slightest thing wrong, you're gone. He'd fire you in a heartbeat. We don't really have that these days, but back then, even though he leans to the left and I lean to the right, I like the way he did things. So why am I telling you that? Because this guy who's coming in April, his name is Robert Dorr, but you can call him Bob. Bob used to work for Governor O'Neill. And now Bob is in charge of veterans programs in Waterbury. And he is in charge of, he has to do something every year for Memorial Day and every year for Veterans Day. And they have a big budget for this. It kind of parallels what happens here in Wallingford. But Bob has done some extraordinary things, and he's going to share with you a story. You've all heard, let me strike that. I'm assuming you've all heard of the World War II ship called the Indianapolis. And I'm assuming you've all heard what happened to the Indianapolis, right? Well, what you don't know is what happened in the water as they're waiting for somebody to come rescue. And Bob is going to share a big part of what happened in the water while they were waiting to get rescued. And it's just a wonderful story. But what I love about Bob is he also is animated. He gets emotional. He gets dramatic. So it ought to be wonderful. And then in May, we have a guest speaker was here once before, and he just has so much stuff that I want all of you to try to get in your seat by 9:45, because if I can, I want to start him by 5:10. His name is Dennis Mannion. He was a Vietnam vet, and I want to say, is it the Battle of Quai San, Bob? Am I saying it right? Dennis Mannion. So I do have some stories I'm going to share with you this morning, but I got to share this story about Dennis Mannion. Dennis Mannion's father went to Notre Dame. Dennis Mannion's father became an FBI agent. So imagine being an FBI agent in the 50s. So this is what I picture. You got a long trench coat. You're always wearing a hat, okay? I don't know what they're called. Is it a fedora? Like a fedora? I just have this vision of his father, what he looked like. You know, he might even had glasses, for all I know. But typical, what you picture an FBI agent would look like in the 50s, I just picture this is what this guy looked like. You wouldn't know an FBI agent today because they're casual most of the time. There was a time you always had to wear a sports coat and a tie. Today, that doesn't seem to be the case. So anyway, Dennis's father asked Dennis, so what's your plans for college? And Dennis said, I don't really have any plans for college. His father said, no, you're going to college. So his father made a bunch of phone calls, and the next thing you know, Dennis was going to Notre Dame. One thing I've heard about Notre Dame is the alumni really take care of the alumni. They're thick as thieves. When you go to Notre Dame, it's almost like you're taken care of for the rest of your life. Now, I know what you're thinking. It's too late for me to go to Notre Dame. I know what you're thinking. Excuse me 1 second. So, I guess one of the things Dennis was pretty good at back in the day, he was a good football player. So he managed to get on the football team. One of the things Dennis was not, he was not strong academically. At the time anyway. His mind was just other places, and I can relate to that. I had attention deficit disorder like you wouldn't believe. I still do. So after, I think, a year, maybe 2 tops, Dennis signs up to go into Vietnam. And his father is brokenhearted. His father is angry. And one day, as he's going into the service, almost kind of like your goodbye, your good luck, see you when you get back. Instead of that, his father handed him a piece of paper. And he said, this is your car loan. I'm no longer paying for it. You are now in charge of it. You decided to go into the Army. You're now in charge of your own life. Good luck. Now, one more caveat to that story is, when Dennis was growing up, they only had one TV. If you can picture that big console black and white TV in the family room, right? Dennis got the gumption up one day to go to his father and say, Dad, you know, you and Mom got your programs that you really like to watch. Would you mind getting a second TV so me and my brother, we could watch shows that we like? Father said, no. And when he told me that story, I just laughed because I remember every now and then, not too often, I was forced to go to my grandparents' house so my parents could go away for the weekend. And I hated Saturday nights at my grandparents' house because Lawrence Welk was on. A 1 and a 2. And anyway, there was a show on at the time called Get Smart. Anybody here Get Smart?
Yeah.
I never got to watch Get Smart. And so I can't tell you how many times I went to bed early because I just could not get into Lawrence Welk. I enjoy it today if I see an old video of one. And I took care of my grandmother, my dad's mom, from the time she was 82 to 103. And I'd have these videotapes of Lawrence Welk, and I was constantly replaying them, playing, and she'd look at him and say, boy, that Bobby, he never seems to get older, does he? Her short-term memory was gone, but the long-term memory was still there. Anyway, so I just can picture Saturday night at Dennis's house, his parents are watching Lawrence Welk, and he and his brother are pulling their hair out. Now, the reason I told you that story is when Dennis got back from Vietnam, he didn't tell his parents he was on his way home. He thought, and I would feel the same way, maybe all of you would feel the same way, he thought he would surprise them. He thought they'd actually be happy to see that he's back home and he's safe and he made it through his 12-month tour. And he walks in the house and there's 3 TVs in the family room. There's the original black and white console and there's 2 more on top of it. And he walks in the living room, he wants to say hi to his mother and give her a hug, but he's looking at these 3 TVs. So he says hi to his mother, and take a guess what the first thing his mother says. Take a guess.
I'm watching the show.
No, almost.
They're watching.
Close.
They're watching the news about Vietnam, right?
That's very good, but here's what she says. Your father's going to kill you. Why didn't you tell us you were coming home? Wonderful way to say welcome home, right? So he said, not for nothing, Mom, but I begged you guys to get a second TV. I go away, and now you got 3? And this is the part that gets me. She said, every night your father wanted to watch each of the news stations because he wanted to know about you every single day. He was hoping maybe he could have caught a glimpse of you, could have got some information. So over the years of my life, I've heard incredible stories of where it seems like there's this tumultuous relationship between a son and a father. But when it really comes down to it, the love that these fathers had for their sons just make you want to cry. It's unbelievable. So Dennis Mannion's going to be here. And to me, Dennis is short. I mean, I wouldn't want to go up against him in the football field back in the day. But I love Dennis Mannion. And so for April and May, we have some great speakers. Okay? All right, can I trouble you all to stand up? I'd like to do the pledge. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. So while you're standing, and as you think about that story of the FBI agent being tough on his son, as you know what's going on in Ukraine today, if there's any stories, any people that touch your heart, any names you want to shout out, but this is our time to just reflect on those that gave their lives so that we could have moments like this together. Thank you very much. Okay. So I have at least one story. We'll see what the time is before I share another story. But I would like to make an announcement. How many of you know that Congress passed a bill saying that on such and such a day will be Vietnam Veterans Memorial Day? How many of you are aware of that? One? Two? So this happened a while ago. And this is going to continue. It's not a forever thing. You know, like when we celebrate Memorial Day, it's forever. But this Vietnam Veterans Memorial Day is good through 2025. Is that correct? Do you remember that?
What do you mean good through?
It seemed to me it was not a forever thing, what I read.
50 years.
Oh, I don't remember that.
Yeah, so,
I know it started 5 years ago, and it's always been March 29th.
okay. I don't know if it's going to be a forever thing. I felt like for some reason they put a time cap on it, which makes no sense to me at all.
50 anniversary.
So let's assume I'm completely wrong, all right? But anyway, March 29th of every year has been designated as Vietnam Veterans Memorial Day. And Beverly had a wonderful idea. She said, why can't we do something at Dutton Park on that day? And so I, at first, was extremely skeptical because I was thinking, well, we got to get permission. Maybe we have to get a permit. What are the cops going to think? Where's everybody going to park? So Beverly handled all of that. And I'm not one, if somebody comes up with an idea, it's just not my DNA makeup to say, no, we're not going to do that. We're not going to do that. So I thought it was a great idea. So 1 week from tonight at 6 o'clock at Dutton Park, how many of you know where Dutton Park is? Okay. You've probably been by it a million times and didn't know it was called Dutton Park. Dutton Park is a triangle piece of land, and it's right next door to a cemetery. Anybody know the name of the cemetery?
A memorial? Yes.
Memoriam.
In
So
memoriam.
near here.
In Memoriam?
Yes.
Okay, so if you know where that is, Dutton Park is right at the entrance. So if you don't know where to park, you use common sense. There are side streets. You can go into the cemetery. We got permission to do that. But we're going to try to hold, believe it or not, a little candlelight vigil in memory of all of those that were in Vietnam. And there's quite a few, I believe, in the monuments in Dutton Park. So,
Can I interject?
of course, go ahead.
When I spoke to the police department to get permission to park on the side streets or on the streets itself near the memorial, there was no problem. There were no permits were required, and he even said he was a Marine actually. His name is Sergeant Blythe, and he said that he's going to let his men know, all the other officers know that this is going to happen on March 29th, and they're all invited if they're off duty. And when I called the cemetery, the same thing happened. He said that a lot of his employees are Vietnam vets. And so he's going to let them know that it's happening on March 29th at 6 o'clock. So we have 2 groups gathering, hopefully, and plus all of you. And I hope you do come. My brother's name is on there. A lot of boys that I went to high school are on there. It's just amazing. And I think it's something that I would love to recognize, and I hope you'll join us. And just for a half an hour, 45 minutes at the most, you can park along the streets. Like Mark said, we can park in the cemetery. We've gotten permission. I made the courtesy call, and they were all for it. So it's happening if you want to make it happen.
Which town is that?
Wallingford. What's the name of the street that the firehouse is on?
North Main.
North Main Street.
Yeah.
Okay, Dutton is on North Main
It's at
Street.
the end of North Main, and you'll dead
Well,
end right into the cemetery. It faces the cemetery entrance.
Now, I know there's a Polish club down the street, but there's 2 ends to North Main, right? We got to know which end is which.
Well, it's-
Don't look at me in that tone of voice. I was trying to be funny.
I don't know.
Okay.
North
It's just
Main
right at the edge
Extension.
of town. I mean, it's right.
Well,
at the
It's
edge
right,
of town.
North Main Extension starts there too.
Okay.
We have the
Okay.
North Main Street
Yeah.
Extension.
Oh, okay.
Now,
We have
there's
to
a
make the
park,
jog.
there's another park right down the street there, which
Yes.
has a lot of parking.
Yes.
So people can even park there if they have to.
So,
Which park is that?
What's it called, Harris? I'm not sure, is it
it's like a
Harris?
recreational park.
Yeah, a lot of the people play pickleball there and
Oh,
stuff
alright.
like that.
Baseball,
I think it's
Little
nice.
League.
All right.
So here's the easiest thing this is how I talk to people. Do you know where the big fire department is in the center of town of Wallingford?
Next to the police station.
May none of your houses ever need the fire department. If you're coming out of the firehouse in a fire truck, and if you turn right, Dutton Park is not even a half a mile straight ahead.
It's a
Okay?
couple of blocks. Couple blocks.
Street and turn left.
Yes, sir.
What's the
Go
name
to
of
the
that?
Colony Restaurant and turn,
Yeah.
And go right up the hill.
Go right up the
Yes.
hill.
Yes.
and at the top of the hill, at the stop
Yeah.
sign, just beyond that, say another 50 feet, you can turn left into the cemetery.
Perfect.
Right up the block
That's
from the
correct.
community pool too.
So here's the thing, we're having this wonderful conversation. I know a lot of you aren't gonna come, I hope you do. If you don't, no worries, no problem, but we're gonna try to do this more and more. Yes,
Well,
sir, did you
I
have
was just
something?
curious, do you have any veteran group gonna come with flags or anything, or not? Or-
Well, there are flags there already. But
There are flags? Okay.
No, not that I know of.
Yeah.
I was going to invite the VFW if they wanted to come.
That's what we are, we are the VFW, 3 of us,
Oh,
the Wallingford.
awesome. Well then.
Yeah.
Well, guess what, you're invited.
Yeah.
I was wondering, you talked to Les, didn't you?
Yes, I did.
Yeah, did you mention to Les about this?
Yes, I did.
Yeah, cause I'm gonna try, cause Les is a Vietnam vet.
Right.
Les
I know.
actually, he spent his whole 13 months in the bush, he never
Oh
came
my
out.
God.
So,
Really,
Wow.
he did.
you know,
I didn't know that.
he doesn't talk much about it.
No.
Okay,
Um,
so,
Huh?
If you, excuse me one
Yeah.
sec. If you do park in the cemetery,
Charlie, yeah.
just make sure the line is clear for people to drive through. You know, they don't want us all congested in there, but just do the best you can.
yes, sir.
You want somebody to send an email out to the American Legion, Post 187?
I would love it.
I'll do that.
Thank you very much.
Oh, good, thank you.
This is what makes all of you wonderful, is there's always somebody that's willing to do something, and I love it. And by the way, I didn't do this last month, but you bought all this food today?
Yeah.
So just, how about a round of applause for Beverly and all the food she bought?
It was all donated, guys. It was all all donated, and I just schlepped it in here, so
Yeah,
it
good time
was,
to
it
get
was
it.
great that all these
Yeah.
stores are giving to you, you know. The Connecticut Natural Food, Stop and Shop, and Walmart is all on that table today.
When I walked in the door and saw a
Somebody has
line,
to go get it.
Yeah.
Thank you.
You're very welcome.
like a buffet line, I thought,
Yeah.
oh, that's good. At least you're getting something out of today. So, anyway, now, some of you might remember this. One of my favorite places in the entire planet is in Dayton, Ohio. It's the United States Air Force Museum. Anybody ever been?
Oh, one more, I'm sorry, one more thing.
Oh, it's too late.
No, I'll feel bad if I don't say something.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Marilee brought the tray of cheese and crackers today.
Thank you. Okay.
Okay.
I'll try not to make a habit of that, all right? But thank you very much. Keep up the good work. Don't stop, all right? Okay, so I saw some hands go up. The Air Force Museum in Dayton, Ohio. It is unbelievable.
Yep.
If you see, you've all seen pictures of the stealth bomber, right? Well, they have one there that you can touch. They have an SR-71. They have the B-1 bomber. They have a B-17. You name the plane, and it's there in a hangar, and you can touch it. The plane that flew Kennedy from Washington, D.C. to Texas, the day that he was assassinated, is in a special hangar. And you can walk through that plane. And what's amazing about that plane is, if you read some of the plaques on the plane, when they couldn't save Kennedy, they were going to fly his body home to Washington, D.C., they were going to put his body in the cargo hold in the bottom of the plane. And the crew said, no way. They commandeered a sawzall, and they cut out a big section of seats right across from what we would call the galley. And I think you've probably all seen that famous picture where, Lyndon Johnson's being sworn in, his wife is next to him, and then Jackie Kennedy is next to Lyndon Johnson. And did you all hear about how much blood was on her that day from her husband? And she refused to do anything about it because she said, I want the world to see what they did to him. When the plane was flying back, when they finally put the body into the passenger area of the plane across from the galley, she sat in the galley all by herself on that whole flight all the way home. She sat directly across from his casket. So you get to walk through that plane at this museum. You don't get to just look at it, you get to go inside and walk through it. I don't know how many presidents were on that plane, but I know George Bush, the first Bush, was the one that said, we need a bigger plane, we're going to the 747. So if you start with the first George Bush and go all the way back to Kennedy, that's how many presidents this particular plane served. But that exact plane that flew him back to DC is in this museum. So I contribute, not a lot, but once a year I like to give them a little bit of money because I love what the museum does, okay? And they're always trying to raise money because there were 3 gigantic hangars. Boom, boom, boom. You started with World War I, then there was World War II, and then present day stuff. There's also a great memorial to Bob Hope there, and video showing him all the times he went to Vietnam. Some of them are hysterical because he tried to talk like 10 times, but these F-4 Phantoms kept taking off. And they're just so loud when they're taking off. So they were raising money because to go see the presidential planes, there's several of them, like they have they have Eisenhower's plane, but they had Roosevelt's plane. And they built a custom elevator so he could roll in with his wheelchair and it was at the back of the plane, and then bring his wheelchair right up into the main fuselage of the plane. So that's another plane you get to walk through and see, and they have a mannequin that looks like him there. It's kind of cool. And then they have a plane called the Valkyrie. Ever hear of the Valkyrie? Anybody? Good job.
B-70, right?
Yeah, so the Valkyrie is such a wicked, wicked looking plane. It's just so cool looking. They built it to be a high altitude supersonic bomber. There's like 6 engines in the back of this thing. And when you're standing underneath it, it looks like to get to the cockpit, it's at least 4 stories high, if not 5 stories. I mean, you wonder, how did these guys get into the cockpit? I mean, it's just so high off the ground. And they built 3 of them. One crashed, so there's 2 left. I don't know where the other one is, but one's at this museum. Maybe the other one's in Washington. But the Valkyrie was on target to be a serious piece of our Defense Department, and then the Russians were able to build a ballistic missile that could shoot it out of the sky even at super high altitude. So that's what happened to the Valkyrie program. So because I contributed, I get this magazine on a fairly regular basis. It's called Friends Journal, and there's incredible stories in here. To me, they're wonderful stories. And today, I'd like to share with you a story about this guy. And the title of the story is Over the Hump. How many of you heard the term over the hump? Great. So I hope, where I can't look at you much because I'm reading, I hope you'll enjoy it. Just pretend I'm some guest speaker you've never seen before. And if you have any questions, yell out my name. Otherwise, I'll just have totally tunnel vision here, okay? But I'd like to share this story with you. With your permission, is that okay? Yeah, don't sound so excited, all right? Okay, I was introduced to flying in 1927 at the age of 4. Some 2 months after Charles Lindbergh made his nonstop flight to Paris. The family was visiting the World's Fair at the time. By the way, how many of you have been to the World's Fair in New York City? First time I ever had a piece of pizza. I was always afraid to try it. It looked gross to me. But now I'm a pizza snob.
Yeah.
But I love the World's Fair in New York. Okay, sorry about that. I'm going to do that from time to time. And my grandmother bought tickets for a sightseeing ride on a Ford Trimotor, Tin Goose. From that day forward, I never wanted to do anything but fly. That desire became a reality in 1939 at age 16 when I got my private pilot's license. I can't tell you how many times I wish that I had learned to fly as a teenager. While attending the Citadel, I would fly from a nearby airfield on rare occasions when money permitted. One Sunday, I rented a Piper J3 Cub and took a friend, Jack Mansfield, over the Charleston area. After landing, we got a ride back to Charleston, and the driver asked, "Have you heard? The Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor this morning." The date was December 7th, 1941. I looked at Jack and said, "Well, there goes our world." I kind of feel like that today because we don't know what Russia's going to do. I often feel like that today, that our lives are about to become turned upside down. I requested and was granted a discharge from the Citadel to join the Navy, with my sights set on a career in naval aviation. Unfortunately, my eyesight wasn't good enough. As an interim measure, I went to work for the Wayland Company in Chattanooga, Tennessee, making production drawings for the breech blocks of 90mm anti-aircraft guns. I left to enroll in the Civilian Pilot Training Program, the CPT. The CPT was a relatively new program for training pilots for military service. These pilots were physically ineligible for aviation cadet training, but could become liaison pilots and instructors in the aviation cadet program. As I already had a private ticket, I applied for the advanced phase of CPT to obtain commercial and flight instructor ratings. I was accepted, but had to become a member of the Army Reserve. In July 1942, with Dad looking on proudly, I raised my right hand and was sworn into the Reserve of the United States. I received orders sending me to Randolph Field, Texas, to complete the Central Instructor School, CS, it's called CIS, in Stearman PT-17s or PT-17s, I'm not sure which one is which, and Fairchild PT-19 Cornells. This was a tough, this was a tough course, conducted in 2 phases and lasting 8 weeks. Upon completion of CIS, I was ordered to report to the 69th Army Air Force's Flying Training Detachment, that's a mouthful, and the southeastern base, Fletcher Field, was located 9 miles north of Clarksdale, Mississippi. How many of you heard of Clarksdale? It's a big SAC wing there. A lot of bombers come out of there. After completing an acceptance check ride in a Stearman, I was assigned to an instructor squadron. As an instructor, I got more out of teaching my first few classes than I did in all the training. It was not difficult in the PT-19 with the 170 horsepower Ranger inline engine, but it was a real challenge in the Stearman. Later it became even more so when we got the Fairchild PT-23s, basically a PT-19 with a 220 horsepower radial engine, the same as on the Stearman. The engine made the airplane nose heavy, particularly in aerobatics. Another problem was that the engine set up excessive vibrations. Let me try this again. Another problem was that the engine set up excessive vibrations, creating numerous fatigue failures in the tail assemblies. If the tail fell off in the traffic pattern at 500 feet, it was disastrous. We lost 7 students in just over a week, and the PT-23s were grounded for good. Nothing in primary flying gave me more pleasure than to solo cadets, generally after 8 hours of dual instruction. When they had demonstrated their readiness, I would pull over alongside the fence bordering the field, get out, fasten the seatbelt, squat down on the wing and say, "You're ready, you can do it. Just remember one thing, the airplane will be much lighter without me in it, so it will really want to climb. Just watch your airspeed and altitude. Now go shoot a landing." What a thrill to watch those kids take the airplane around and shoot a great landing most of the time. Months passed, cadets classes came and went, and the war dragged on, and the production rate of military aircraft increased daily. There was a need to get the new aircraft to the combat operational units, both in the States and overseas. Consequently, the Air Transport Command was created, and a new division was the Ferrying Command. I applied for transfer to ATC and was accepted. So now I'm going to stop here. How many of you were fans of Johnny Carson? Big fan of Johnny Carson. Some of my fondest memories are sitting next to my dad late at night watching a Johnny Carson show. And one night, if you're facing Johnny Carson, you had Bob Hope, then you had Dean Martin, and then this guy came out named George Goebel. How many of you remember George Goebel?
Wilson George.
So, George Goebel's a wonderful, kind, sweet man. So George is sitting in the chair, and what he doesn't know is George has a cocktail in his hand, because back then that's how those guys rolled. You know, they were all smoking on stage, drinking on stage. He's got a drink in his hand, and Dean Martin's smoking, and he's flicking his ashes in George Goebel's glass. Now the audience is going hysterical, and George doesn't have a clue what's going on. Johnny sees what's going on, and he's laughing because he knows George doesn't have a clue what's going on. And so the place is laughing, and George is starting to talk. And at one point, George says, "Did you ever feel like a tuxedo with brown shoes?" But Johnny Carson said to him, "So George, it's my understanding that you were a pilot in World War II. "Yes, I was." And he says, you know, I'll have you know, not one enemy aircraft ever got past our, however he said it, it was hysterical, because we know there were no enemy aircraft that ever came into the United States. So he said not one enemy aircraft made it past us. And we didn't even have guns, he said. So now the place is laughing hysterically. So every time I hear about an instructor pilot, I think of George Coble. Okay. I was sent to Greenville, Mississippi to obtain an Army instrument rating, then to Blytheville, Arkansas to get a multi-engine rating. One of the reasons I wanted to read this story to you is this guy's been all over the place. He hasn't even gone to combat yet. I was sent to Greenville, Mississippi to obtain an, I read that part. At Greenville, we flew the Vultee BT-13 Valiant, spending hours under the hood in the rear cockpit. The hood, a canvas contraption, was pulled over your head and fastened to the top of the instrument panel to prevent your seeing out. The instructor rode in the front cockpit. Instrument takeoffs were the norm. Let me read that again. The instructor rode in the front cockpit. Instrument takeoffs were the norm, and a real challenge to keep the airplane on the runway by means of the directional gyro. Once off the ground, it was routine to climb out for air work. We employed the buddy system for time under the hood, and I teamed up with Bill Shelton, who had been a primary instructor at Americus, Georgia. We tried to outfox each other with unusual attitudes of the airplane. A favorite was to cage the gyros to mask the airplane's attitude. Then Bill would roll it onto its back, give it back to me, and watch my recovery from this most unusual attitude. We took turns at this and other gyrations, trying to fool each other. Sounds like fun. Here, you get to play it and you're upside down. Excuse me. The multi-engine training at Blytheville was in a Beechcraft AT-10, Wichita, a large, heavy plywood airplane. The curriculum emphasized single-engine procedure. As I was growing up and getting into planes, one of the things I always heard was all the Beechcrafts, any Beechcraft, were really nice airplanes, but they were very, very difficult to fly. There was always a challenge to flying them. You really had to be on your A game. An element of introduction into ATC was a trip to the high-altitude chamber of Maxwell Field, Montgomery, Alabama. Are you keeping track of all the places this guy's been? We went into the chamber, were briefed, and volunteers were used to demonstrate what would happen upon losing oxygen at high altitudes. I volunteered and was pressurized to something like 25,000 feet. They had me take off my mask, untie my shoes, and then retie them. After untying my shoes, I began retying them and realized that everyone was laughing. After 15 seconds, I had passed out and was recovering after they put the mask back on me. There was no break in the mental process, and I proceeded with the assigned task. This was a graphic illustration of hypoxia. There is no warning that you're about to lose consciousness, and no recollection of what occurred. The Army's regulation, oxygen mask on at 10,000 feet. With training completed, we were commissioned as flight officer service pilots. Our wings bore an S in the shield, another badge of distinction. It indicated that we had come from an extensive flying background before entering the service. That triggered mean-spirited vindictiveness by some who were jealous that we had not gone through the ACP. When I later served in India under General William Tunner, here's another place, India. I ran into more of this attitude. He issued an order stating that as long as he was the commanding general, no flight officer in his command would ever be promoted. I was nominated several times, but all requests were denied. It was 8 years before I reached my ultimate rank of first lieutenant. I was next assigned via Curtiss P-40 Warhawk transition at Greenwood, Mississippi, to ATC's 3rd Ferrying Group at Romulus, Michigan. We ferried to modification centers and combat units anything, single and multi-engines that were assigned. However, most activity centered on flying Ford-built consolidated B-24 Liberators from the Ford Motor Company's Willow Run plant to modification centers around the country. Anybody want to take a guess what a modification center is? Go ahead.
Puts the guns on.
Yeah, getting it ready for military use. I love all your blank stares on your faces right now. I'm trying to give you neat stuff. I'm hoping you anyway. So, I have a friend who is a senior engineer at Electric Boat, and he's highly involved with the development of our most sophisticated submarines. And it's amazing what questions you can ask and what questions he will answer and what questions he will not answer. And it becomes fun after a while because you have to think of, when you're asking your question, you have to use your brains a little bit, say, how can I get this information from him so he doesn't give up his top secret stuff and I don't want to know the top secret stuff. So I had fun formulating questions. But I'd say, I asked him a question when it came to armaments, and he just flat out said, I have no idea. We send the ship to another place, and they take care of all that. I said, oh, okay. And I was just asking him about the propeller one day. No, we don't make the propeller. I'm just like, how do you not make the propeller? You make everything else. But they don't even make a lot of the actual, of the hull of the ship. So much stuff is farmed out. Anyway, the modern day propellers are really neat looking to me. It looks like if you look in the bottom of a food processor, that's kind of what it looks like. Okay, I'm boring you. Let me go. So, oh, by the way, who flew the B-24? Who made it famous? Anybody know? Doolittle. There's the Doolittle Raiders that flew B-24s on their raid to Tokyo. Okay. Production rate was high. One B-24 out the door every hour. Wow. That manufacturer outpaced the latest design drawings. I'm sorry, I got to digress again. So, how many of you saw the movie Ford versus Ferrari? If you haven't seen it, you got to watch it. It's fantastic, and there's a brief mention in that movie about Ford making these airplanes. Okay. So the airplanes had to be taken to modification centers to be dismantled and rebuilt to current specifications. Isn't that funny? At the end center at St. Paul, Minnesota, when the plant doors opened, there were literally acres of women swarming all over the airplanes on the line. It was awesome to see them tear the planes apart and reassemble them. The Rosie the Riveters were demonstrating that women could do equally well as men in the production and modification of military aircraft. We were constantly on the go with deliveries, sometimes out for as long as 30 days. One type of airplane would be delivered, another type would be picked up and taken somewhere else. We repeated the process from base to base and then rode the airlines back home. Most of those flights were in Douglas DC-3s filled totally with ATC pilots. One delivery of a B-24 was to Cheyenne, Wyoming. There, the operations officer said he had a Boeing B-17 to go to a combat unit at Savannah, Georgia, and asked if we were qualified. You bet, we said. I had never been in a B-17, and on the way out, I asked the guy with me if he ever had. He replied, once. No sweat then, we can do it. It can't be much different from a B-24 except for the tail dragger configuration. Everybody know what a tail dragger is?
Yeah.
It's got the little tiny wheel in the back, okay? There's actually a picture of this plane is considered a tail dragger even though that's not a B-24. Okay. We can do that. We went through the field manual, fired it up, and left for Love Field, Dallas, Texas. Other than the unusual throttle configuration, it was just another 4-engine bird. At Savannah, we picked up a Douglas A-26 Invader for Louisville, Kentucky, and from there another B-24 for delivery to the Canadians at Montreal. This one was loaded almost 5 tons over gross with radar equipment for anti-submarine patrol. The runway at Louisville was 10,000 feet, and we used every inch of it at 1 a.m. in the driving rain. Wow. Upon landing in Montreal, we found tree leaves and twigs in the engine columns. The landing there was on an inch or more of clear ice, also on a 10,000-foot runway. We steamed in at 150 miles an hour. Normal over the fence was 140, and used every inch here also. The man in the tower told us to turn off at the first intersection. We still were doing over 100 and didn't dare touch the brakes. He kept issuing turn-off instructions, and we missed all of them as we rolled to the very end of the runway. Now, my oldest brother, who comes up to here on me, was in the Air Force. He got his private pilot license, and one day we flew out of Bridgeport. My brother would never wear headphones, and I was always angry at him. We're coming in for a landing, but because the engine was so loud, he couldn't hear what the guy in the tower said for him to do next. So what does my brother do? Not knowing exactly what to do, he pulls into one of those between the taxiway and the the runway. You know that intersection lane? He pulls in there and he stops. Next thing you know, the guy from the tower is screaming at him. And it was a scary, scary moment for me. But we survived. As you can tell, I'm here. But that's what this reminds me of. The guy in the tower is screaming at him, would you please turn, would you please turn? The guy in the tower doesn't realize I'm dealing with a sheet of ice. Right? Okay. It was always great to get back to Romulus, spend a day or two. The Officers Club was one of the ATC's best. The food was excellent, and the mess was staffed with German POWs. Wow. Wow. But all good things come to an end. I got orders to report to the Overseas Training Unit at Homestead, Florida, for Douglas C-54 Skymaster and B-24 training. The base was operated by American Airlines under contract to the Army, and all the flight instructors were former airline pilots. Most service pilots would wind up in India, flying the hump over the Himalayas into China. So we were to learn airline techniques for maximizing range and fuel economy. Time in the Link Instrument Trainer, called simulators today, was part of the routine. The trainers were not sophisticated and were difficult to fly, but I came to enjoy their challenge. The instructor told me to come over anytime and he would give me my fill of time. As a result, I became quite proficient in the darn thing, really learned needle and ball using the basic turn and bank indicator. Many times over, the hump, I was grateful for that. So the needle and the ball, there's a ball in the dash and with little tiny wings. And if you do this, the gauge doesn't move, of course, but you can see the wings doing this. Did you know that? Yes. After this period, I went back to Romulus in the usual routine. However, orders soon came sending me to my port of embarkation, Nashville, Tennessee, for overseas orders. There I got orders to go to Miami to pick up did I read that? I did that. Sorry about that. I met the rest of my crew in Miami. The navigator was part of the ATC contingent to regularly flew between states and overseas theaters, guiding crews to their destinations. The radio operator was going over for the first time to stay. While awaiting completion of the operations paperwork, he kept getting drunker and drunker. When we finally got on board, he put his head down on the radio table and didn't wake up until we landed at our first stop in Bermuda. We left Miami around 2 a.m. and headed over the ocean, ahead illuminated by lightning flashes. Lighting up the whole sky was an ominous wall of thunderstorms, reaching at least to 40,000 feet. I thought, wouldn't it be ironic if we got no further than this wall of storms? Well, we got through, but it was one whale of a ride. We went from Bermuda to the Azores, to dirty, stinking Casablanca, across the desert of North Africa, looking down on the mind-boggling zillion tracks of armored vehicles crossing in every direction in the sand, and the carcasses of Rommel's destroyed army, trying to visualize what that hell must have been like to Tripoli, to Cairo, to Abadan, Iran, and on to Barakpur. The Mediterranean Sea had the clearest, most brilliant blue water I've ever seen. Cairo was striking from the air. We were over the desert for the longest time, and up pops this gorgeous green oasis, watered from the Nile and so lush in its contrast to the surroundings. We first diverted to circle around the pyramids and Sphinx. What awesome sights. Upon walking into our overnight quarters, I found Ray Cope, who had been in my same unit at Romulus. We went into Cairo to the Shepherd Hotel, which was straight out of a Bogart movie, the gathering place for service people of all nations. The hotel later was destroyed by fire. The air base was a good distance from Cairo, and we had to take cabs both ways. All the drivers were wild men more suitable to driving camels. The ride in wasn't too bad, but coming back was awful. The driver never turned on his headlights, and there was one near collision after another. The cab stank to high heaven, and we discovered that during the day the driver removed the rear seat and hauled loads of camel dung in the back. On leaving Cairo and heading for Abadan, we crossed the southern portion of what was then Palestine of Christ's day. Figuring we likely would never see this area again, we detoured northward and flew all around the Dead Sea, Jerusalem, Jericho, and other key points of biblical history. I couldn't get over how barren and desolate most of the country was, and wondered why God chose that land to send his son to die for our salvation. Abadan, Iran, was a miserable place. Serving on the chow line were the biggest, ugliest, sourest women I had ever seen. They were Russians and looked as if they could break you in two with a snap of the wrist. Their quarters were enclosed by a barbed wire fence, and we commented that it must be to protect the women. No, we were told that's to protect the men by making sure they never get in. Before reaching Barakpur, we crossed Agra, the site of the Taj Mahal. And if I'm not pronouncing these things correctly, please forgive me. We went to an altitude just sufficient to clear the roof and spires and cross right up the center line of the long reflecting pool out front. It is an awesome structure. After delivering the C-54, flight was 22 hours, 40 minutes from Miami. I rode a Douglas C-47 SkyTrain shuttle to Calcutta for further orders. I was there longer than expected and had to send nearly all my clothes to the base laundry. That's when I got orders to report to the B-24 base at, I don't know how to pronounce this, I'm going to say Tezpur, up in the Assam Valley. I said goodbye to my uniforms and boarded another C-47 shuttle just as the sun was going down. The CBI Theater and Flying the Hump were held in throat-gripping fear. The weather was known to be the most violent in the world. Hair-raising stories abounded. 42 airplanes were lost in just one night due to the weather. All who went to the CBI did so with a great deal of trepidation, and I was no different. This night, proceeding up the valley only compounded my fears. Soon we were in thunderstorms and severe turbulence. There were 4 of us on board, 3 gravel pounders, non-flying types, and me. The rest of the airplane was filled with cargo tied down to the seats. One thermal ripped the seat from the floor, shot it upward, and punched a sizable hole in the top of the fuselage. I don't know what a thermal is. I don't think he means to say thermos.
Thermal.
Air pocket.
Up there.
A what?
An air pocket.
Hot air.
Okay.
Hot air.
Oh, I get it now. Thank you. I'm so engrossed in reading, I couldn't picture it. The gravel pounders were throwing up all over the place. I was sitting there in stark terror, but saying to myself, man, you've got wings on. You can't look concerned or get sick. Just then, the door to the cockpit opened and 2 empty beer cans came flying out. Shortly thereafter, 2 more followed. Then another 2. Then the co-pilot staggered through the door to collapse in an empty seat in front of me. And finally, believe it or not, out staggered the pilot. He collapsed in the seat next to the co-pilot. That's when I almost had heart failure. I later learned that this was standard leg pulling for the new troops entering the theater. After a brief period of letting the autopilot fly the airplane, the crew made its way back to the cockpit. Then we negotiated the storms to finally reach Tezpur. That's not the end of the story, but I love that kind of humor, don't you? I think that was wonderful. There were only 2 ATC B-24 groups in the CBI, one at Tezpur and the other at Jorhat. Hope I'm saying these correctly. A base further up in the Assam Valley, the airplanes were modified versions of the B-24, one with the insides hogged out and modified to provide a cargo hold, the C-87 it said. The other was a stripped-down version crammed full of tanks that held almost 5,000 gallons of high-octane gasoline, the C-109. This was known as, as the C-109 boom, given their proclivity for blowing up. Oh, geez. We flew and trailed, not in formation, across the hump. And it was a sobering sight on a dark night to see a brilliant flash ahead as another C-109 blew everyone into oblivion. They were, however, somewhat a favorite of mine because they were later model B-24s and still had working autopilots. There was no maintenance for the autopilots, so when those in the old D models went on the fritz, they were just pulled and tossed. From then on, it was a matter of hand flying the airplane all the time. The B-24 wasn't the most nimble ship, and when they became war-weary and all out of trim, it really was work even with 2 sharing the load. Soon after, I was transferred to Jorhat and assigned to a tent with 2 second lieutenants who had gone through ACP. Our tents were the British pyramidal types with the double canvas on top, the airspace supposedly making them cooler. Believe me, at 120 to 130 humid degrees on the ground, there was no perception of cooling. Our cots were enveloped by mosquito nets. Our cots were enveloped by mosquito nets. One of the first chores upon arrival was to get to the nearest village ASAP and haggle with a street vendor for a mattress for the cot. During the monsoon season, everything became mildewed and smelled to high heaven. Nothing would eradicate the odor, and the lack of direct sunshine didn't help. A large tree overhung the tent, and that's where we kept a pet monkey, Bumpy. He became pretty tame and enjoyed being held. We paid bearers a few rupees, then worth 30 cents, to come in daily to sweep out the tent and take our uniforms and other clothing out for laundry. That entailed beating it on a rock in the nearest bit of water. The clothes always stank when they were returned, and in the monsoon season, they would come back folded up but soaking wet. My bear was a nice kid, 14 years old, and had a wife. Okay. Their life expectancy was only about 35, so marriage age was anywhere from 10 on up. I enjoyed talking to him, although he didn't know much English, and I treated him kindly. He bought me a leather name tag for my A2 jacket with the Indian characters inscribed above my name. When I transferred to search and rescue, he stood in front of the tent and cried. Before leaving, however, I was notified that I had a package at operations. Lo and behold, it was the laundry I had sent out in Calcutta months earlier. Weather over the hump was everything I had heard, and then some. Its motto, bring me men to match my weather. Between it and night flights, I made almost a dozen trips before I got my first good luck at the rock pile, another nickname for the Himalayas. It left me speechless. The Tennessee mountains where I grew up were mere foothills by comparison with the rock pile. I wondered how anyone could survive going down in that terrain, but many did. The routes to Burma and China were code-named, and the highest were assigned to the B-24s, nominally 26,000 to 28,000 feet. Ironically, their code name was Easy. We flew our first few trips as co-pilots until we were oriented to the routes and destinations. Lightning and thunderstorms in the States were mere child's play by comparison with hump weather, and it's infinitely difficult to convey what it was like to plow through thunderstorm buildups, often extending well up to 60,000 feet. Wow. It was said the thunderstorms never were as bad as they looked. They were worse. Hump pilots earned the dubious distinction of being the most experienced severe weather pilots in the world, then and now. At the altitudes we normally flew, there was no option but to plow through all the weather lying between us and China, go to full RPM, lower the gear, put down the flaps, and ride it out, praying the airplane would stay together in the 100 to 200 mile per hour vertical winds and the thunderstorms. Penetrating the downdraft side, you would be slammed upward against the seat belt, then viciously downward into the seat on the updraft side. Dirt and debris from the bowels of the airplane swirled all over the cockpit. Instrument light covers would fly off and become missiles. The air would turn blue from the lightning, and some of the crashes of thunder were so awful they could be heard above the, I don't know that word, of sound taking place. Okay. Static electricity buildup is torrential rain and hail caused St. Elmo's fire. Let me read this again. Static electricity buildup in torrential rain and hail caused St. Elmo's fire to cover the entire windshield. Superimposed big rings of fire around the tips of each propeller. On each wingtip would be a huge blue bale of fire riding along until ultimately discharging into the atmosphere. In the trailing edges of the ailerons were discharge wicks for static electricity, which would be blown to bits when the balls went. It took both of us to fly the airplane, but all we could do was try to keep the nose level, nothing else. The B-24 would wallow like a huge whale. Many times I would have both feet up on the instrument panel to provide extra leverage for the pull necessary just to control the nose. Severe weather pilots? You bet. And you just had to be there to really understand. I was routed back from China one night at 31,200 feet, which put me above the cloud deck. But penetrating it like fingers extending upward were many buildups that had to go to 40,000 feet or more. As it was a bright moonlight night, it was easy to thread our way through them. The outside temperature was 65 degrees below zero. Wow. And I almost froze. When I had left Jorhat for a short flight into Burma to deliver an engine, I took only my A2 jacket. Big mistake. After delivering the engine, I was loaded up with guns and ammunition and sent on to China. I could only get to 31,000 coming back because I was empty. 30,000 was about it for the B-24. We had some heated flying suits on board, so we plugged them in and laid them across our legs. The heated suits were a joke. They concentrated the heat in the middle of the back, and that's all you got. The heaters in the B-24 were also a joke in such temperatures. You were lucky to get just a breath of warm air out of them. So by the time we got back over the Assam Valley, we all were shaking so violently that the airplane was almost out of control and my feet and lower legs were totally numb. I made a maximum rate descent, no such thing as consideration of shock cooling off engines in those days. But even after getting back into all the heat on the ground, it was an hour or more before I could begin to feel anything in my feet. My medical debriefing consisted solely of a shot of rot gut booze. While at Kunming, the Chinese base where I mostly flew to after deliveries, a B-24 came in with the fuselage severely distorted from the beating they had taken. With huge shear wrinkles from nose to tail, and the entire tail assembly canted to the left at least 3 degrees, the airplane was immediately grounded and declared surplus for the scrap heap. The Chinese, who were enmeshed in their own internal battles with the communist forces, bought it. A Chinese crew arrived, fired it up, and left. The Chinese were buying everything they could get their hands on and storing it under every haystack in China. Look under many haystacks and there would be a P-51, not fighting the war with the Japanese, but being held in reserve for their own internal conflict. Their battle was really going on the night when I went to Lushin, China, for the first time. Carrying an entire load of canned tomatoes, I almost bought the farm on final approach. The downwind leg of the pattern had to be flown on the opposite side of the mountain, and to turn to the base leg was made on a timed basis after last seeing the runway. Rollout on final brought the approach parallel to a river bordering the airport. Chinese nationalists were on the field side. The communists were on the opposite bank. They were firing at each other across the river and the runway. And here I came right between the opposing factions. Visibility was awful. I kept letting down, then suddenly I see to the left red approach lights whizzing by. We were down in the river, not knowing how far above the water. Emergency power, and we go around to a successful approach and landing. Upon checking into operations, we were asked what our manifest was. I said, canned tomatoes. The ops officer said, my God, we've got all the fresh tomatoes we can eat. Take them back to India. I told them how we had almost killed ourselves getting those tomatoes over there, and there was no way we were taking them back. So we went out to the airplane and dumped all the tomatoes in the drainage ditch besides the... It looked like right along the river, and went back to India. Not long after, another returning flight brought those tomatoes back. Isn't that something? Experiences everyone had with transporting Chinese army troops were almost unbelievable. The first load of troops I had to deal with was moving them from Chengdu to Kunming, following delivery of a load of cargo. About 2:30 in the morning, we were told the troops were waiting at the airplane to be loaded. Approaching in a jeep, we were overwhelmed by the stench of human bodies that hadn't been washed for ages. The dust was ankle deep, and most of them were lying around in it. They were also young, and it was hard to believe they were army troops. We herded them on board and motioned for them to sit on the cargo floor. Most just squatted. Operations had provided several wash tubs, which we distributed along the deck, pantomiming that they were to throw up in if they got airsick. When we got to Kunming, the tubs were clean, but the deck was a mess. The flight was not at a real high altitude, so they all remained conscious. All right, I'll try to get this done by 11:30. I'm almost there. Does anybody have any questions, anything they want to say? Am I keeping anybody? Do you want me to finish? I can finish at another time? Okay, I'll take that as keep going. Most times we tried to get altitudes at which they would be knocked out from lack of oxygen, but that didn't work for all. Those from mountainous regions were accustomed to thin air. Cold was a problem at the higher altitudes as the troops wore flimsy clothing. On one flight we smelled smoke, and the crew chief found they were hacking up the wooden cargo deck with their bayonets and had built a fire. This presented an extreme danger because the floor booster pumps for the engines were located along the rear wing spar in the cargo hold area. They all leaked constantly, dripping gasoline into the area. You can't make this up. It was necessary to issue a submachine gun to each aircraft, and the crew chief would sit on the steps to the cockpit with the gun pointed at the troops. If he had orders, shoot to kill if necessary. However, it usually sufficed to wave or point the muzzle to the deck, indicating sit. They obeyed. We often flew with no doors on the airplanes in order to jettison cargo in case we lost engines. I witnessed an instance at Chengdu where the troops, unaccustomed to and afraid of flight, decided to abandon ship just as the B-24 pilot pulled the nose up on takeoff. They all rushed to the rear of the ship to jump out the door. This completely stalled the ship, and they mushed into the trees. The crew survived, but I don't know how many of the troops were killed. Runways at the Chinese airfields were under constant maintenance by thousands of laborers. Runway bases were hammered out by hand, and ox-driven carts were used to haul large rocks to be broken down. The Chinese are very superstitious, and one belief held that each person had an evil dragon following close behind. Therefore, the closer you could come to being killed from behind, the better the odds for ridding oneself of the dragon. I don't know if that made sense to you. So coolies would line up alongside the runway as we made our approaches, then stream across the runway just as the wheels touched. While many made it across, there also were many whoops as the props cut them to ribbons. Oh boy. I saw one old man start across the runway with his ox and cart as a North American P-51 Mustang flared for landing. The man, ox, cart, and plane were demolished. He sure got rid of his dragon. My most frightening flight was in a C-87 serial number, it's not important, from Chengdu back to India. We were around 26,000 feet in the soup amidst thunderstorms and totally lost, a condition all too familiar in hump operations. There was only frying bacon hash over the radios, and the automatic direction finder kept swinging wildly. Did you understand that? The noise in the radio was sounded like bacon cooking? Okay. Those being our only navigation tools, we had no way to determine where we were. Our only hope was to try and climb, although unauthorized, and attempt to get out of the weather so that we could get reception. Just as we broke out between layers at 20,000 feet, there was a heart-stopping scream as the prop on the number 3 engine ran wild, increasing in speed. I hit the feathering button. Nothing happened. The engine got hotter and hotter to the point of glowing red. I hit the fire extinguisher button. Nothing happened. That prop had to be stopped, else it either would fly apart and rip through the cockpit, or the vibration would tear the engine off its mounting, most likely causing the ship to blow up as the engine fire reached the fuel tanks. The vibration was awful. With stuff flying around in the cockpit, it seemed that everything was coming apart. The only option left was to load the prop up by pulling the ship up into a near stall. That worked. The prop stopped. However, it didn't last. As soon as the nose was lowered to regain speed, the prop ran away again. This occurred on the second try and the third. I turned around to the crew chief and jerked my thumb toward the rear. We were going to bail out. I'll never forget the look on his face. His eyes over the top of his oxygen mask were big as saucers and frozen on me. He unbuckled and was ready to go as soon as we got out of our seats. I decided to give it one more try, and miracle of miracles, the prop stopped and held when the nose came back down. When we stopped shaking, we got our bearings and made it home on 3 engines and minimum fuel. Approaching the field, I declared an emergency, was told by the tower to wait out and hold. I responded with some choice language and was immediately cleared to land. Later inspection of the ship revealed that the hydraulically operated feathering circuit had no fluid, and neither did the fire extinguisher system. Punitive action later was taken with the ground maintenance crew, but the only thing that salvaged our emotions was that shot of rock gut, booze, and medical debriefing. Every August, in celebration of Army Air Forces Day, there was intense competition among the bases to see which could transport the most tonnage. One C-46 base ran completely out of cargo, so trees and bushes were dug up and loaded on board. A ship lost an engine on takeoff and mushed into the trees. Fortunately, no one was killed. At the same time, a team of congressmen were touring the theater and happened to be on the base. They put an immediate stop to that sort of idiocy. None of the pilots objected. I wonder how many remembered there were 2 VJ days. One was false and the other was real. I was on the ground when the false one was declared, and all hell broke loose. People went crazy, firing 45s in all directions. It was only safe to hit the deck and stay there. Bamboo furniture from the officers' club and the entire tent area was piled up and set afire. Then came the announcement, false alarm, so the troops had nothing to sit or sleep on. Shortly after the real VJ Day occurred, I was on the way back over the hump from China just as it was turning dawn. What a glorious experience to see the sun coming up over myriad cloud formations and to hear on the radio. Yes, it really is true this time. The war is over. Thunderstruck was the only emotion I can recall. Altogether, I made 97 flights over the hump, most of them in the B-24, carrying every category of hard goods, guns, ammunition, jeeps, troops, replacement engines. The only non-essential manifest I ever had was the load of canned tomatoes referred to earlier. While it had its faults, the B-24, much maligned by the B-17 worshippers, was a workhorse and performed gallantly in its mission. All who flew the hump were awarded the wings of the Chinese Air Force in addition to the decoration equivalent to our Distinguished Flying Cross, the Chinese Order of the Flying Cloud, and the China Memorial. In design, the pilot's wings are the equivalent of our commercial pilot's wings with a wreath around a star. They are topped with a five-leaf clover, the plum flower, the Chinese national flower. Just outside the museum at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, in a garden filled with memorials to various Air Force units of World War II, prominently located and one erected in August 1984 by the Hump Pilots Association, on the back is a 97-pound chunk of the rock pile taken from the high mountain ridges north of, I can't pronounce this word, Peoshan. It looks like Peoshan, China, approximately halfway between India and China. An emergency landing field was located there. On the front of the CBI shoulder patch, a bailout flag as worn on the A-2 flight jackets, and a composite aircraft to represent the many types of aircraft, gliders, and helicopters used in the CBI. An inscription reads, erected by the China, Burma, India Hump Pilots Association, a group of their comrades, families, and friends. On the back, an inscription reads, in memory of those United States and Allied personnel who flew in the Himalayas and the China, Burma, India theater in World War II. Underneath is a profile of rugged mountain terrain. I had visited the memorial once, and it was a sobering, thought-provoking experience. You know what's really sad is there was a time when the United States and China got along. And today, that's not the case. And if they could only hear this story, maybe it would cause them time to pause. I hope you enjoyed that. I hope you got something out of it. I always try to be ready in case somebody doesn't make it. So next Tuesday, we have a little memorial for Vietnam veterans. I'm grateful for people bringing food, and thank you so much for the cheese. Did you bring cheese and crackers?
Anytime.
Well, thank you. Keep it up. Keep up the good work, as they say.